Yeah, it's a good question. I think there isn't a single indicator that determines whether a region has a credible exit option, but one that we looked at was the preferences of the public for leaving. And that alone is not sufficient, but I think it's necessary in some sense, at least in a democracy. The other is that the region could be economically independent by itself. I think I can think of other situations where it would have to be literally on the periphery, rather than, like, for example, yeah, not like Tatarstan, right? It's in the middle of Russia. It may want to secede, but it would have a lot of problems trying to trade and to exit and so on. So there's a geographic component of credibility, I think. There's a sort of public opinion component of credibility. There's a fiscal component of it. Can it be economically independent? Is it economically viable as an independent unit? And then, of course, there are security considerations as well. If it becomes independent, can it defend itself? Which is maybe not such a consideration here, but in other cases, a small state surrounded by big states would not have a credible exit option, because it would be, if as soon as it became independent, it would be annexed by another state.
Which raises the question of what would the EU do about an independent Catalonia? Would it accept, and the Scotland too, would it accept an independent Catalonia as a member of the EU, like Malta, or would it not? And the same with Scotland. And that would also affect probably the credibility of the threat, and also would obviously be an issue in the campaign for a referendum.
And so if the EU clarified its position on this, which it apparently hasn't, and maybe won't, it would reduce the uncertainty immensely and increase the credibility of exiting.
Because that would remove the security.
And also a number of other, which is, one of the reasons why sometimes there's this sort of hard distinction between internal and external secessions. And this Swiss case is an internal one. It's not becoming an independent state. It's simply separating from one canton to join another. But in some settings, in some parts of the world, that distinction really is significant. But I think in sort of West European context, it's not as such a sharp distinction between internal and external secession.
Clearly, the existence of the EU, the mere existence of the EU, makes it a lot more feasible for Scotland and Catalonia and any other periphery to consider secession than previously, because if you could join the EU, lots and lots of problems would be taken care of. The Isle of Man is thinking of seceding as well. Yeah, the Isle of Man,
About on the EU debate, there will be a paradox, because on the individual basis, we will still be European citizens. Maybe it will be much easier to find a reverse Cyprus solution. That's to say, maybe Catalonia as a whole, as a land, will not be part of the EU formally, but the 7.5 million citizens living on the basis of Catalonia will still remain European citizens. At least that's an option.
I don't exactly understand.
Yeah, it's just the opposite in Cyprus. Cyprus, you have the land, the physical land, is part of the EU, but half of the population is not a citizen of the EU.
The Turkish.
Yeah. That was an option that was considered by, Kaigala-Flan, which is one of the most relevant advisors to actual Prime Minister in Germany.
So you're saying that the issue of EU membership is not as salient as it otherwise might be?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Because, for example, when you use a model about the question she made, one of the difficulties is how to categorize this credible threat. You said, well, there's a lot of factors, possibilities. With all my respects from an academic point of view, that's the same to say, oh, I don't know. If you don't present how you built up this index, we cannot discuss. That's to say, for example, in Catalonia, there's around 50% of both castes explicitly demanding or supporting the independence, but at the same time, you can find 80% of both castes demanding to use the voice in a referendum. So it's not the same model that you draw up with a canton and a region, just with a dialogue in one way. To say, well, we want to exit, or you are not credible, so let's give you some concession. Here you have multi-level dynamics, because there's not only those claiming for independence, but also you have to add those claiming just to cast a vote on independence. If 80% of population in Catalonia were claiming to cast a vote on a referendum were independent, I do agree with you, surely become independent. But in fact, you have to work with these two scenarios, plus another one. The center is not a unified actor. You have to include, for example, the other subnational governments dealing with the possibility that one part of the state become independent. So it's really complex. So I've been working a lot of time with rational models on forming coalition governments and so on. And finally, I realized that if rational models are quite useful in some, especially at the beginning of trying to understand the process, further on you need to include more and more and more elements that make the model not useful, because always you need something that cannot be reduced to a variable. In any case, it's so interesting in our approach.
But one of the points that you make, I guess, is that Catalonia doesn't even have a voice option, right? Because the center will not permit a referendum to be done, right? So that there's no voice option. Right? So the very first issue, I guess, in Catalonia is to make that referendum possible, right?
I mean, in the Swiss case, this is a non-issue because they vote about everything.
Everything is a referendum.
Should we have
right?
Everything.
So everything
so
is
it's not even. It's a very good point.
Yeah. So there's no voice option. No, it's very complicated, right? We certainly understand that. There is the domino effect kind of thing could happen as well. Absolutely.
I would just make one comment on. I agree with the point about coalitions and unitarization of the center. So I won't contest that at all. On the credibility option, this is not an empirical model, so it's just kind of a sort of thought exercise. The first part was empirical, but it's hard to analyze because we don't see who says what to who behind the scenes. We only hear it after they tell us. Sometimes they don't tell us. So I think in this juror case, anyway, I think the credibility is primarily determined by bilingual status, which translates into political power. And the reason I said it could be this or it could be that is simply that I'm cognizant that in each context, that credibility will vary. So in the Catalan context, it's not going to be bilingualism. And in some other context, it will be something else. So we hope that rather than saying, we don't know what credibility is, that it's a sort of umbrella under which one case it's about this, another case it's about that, and obviously you need to know a lot about the context
And I think there's another case that we ought to be thinking about, which is the case of Kurdistan, in which there is seemingly no credible threat because none of the great powers in the region or in the world at this point are prepared to allow the Kurds to become an independent nation. And so whatever the strength of Kurdish public opinion about separatism is, and my guess is it's extremely strong, it's still not credible if Turkey and the United States and Russia and Iran and
Iraq and
Syria and Iraq refuse to even put it on the table. So that makes that threat, however popular secession might be for the Kurds, at this point it's still not credible because of the geopolitical situation.
There's another group called the Baluk. They're in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. And it's the same issue because not only do you have to have a credible exit option from one state, but from 3 or from 4, which is not.
Excuse me, but these are models where the state is not really funded.
Yeah.
It's a normal state. You cannot play with the same rules analyzing institutions southern European states with Russian states. I mean, the state doesn't exist.
Well, it exists in Iran. It doesn't exist in Afghanistan.
It exists in Syria too, actually.
Yeah.
Read the papers.
But just as you said, the center is not unified, so it's similarly with the periphery. The periphery has to be unified in order to negotiate successfully. And the Kurds are not unified in this way, the Baluk are not unified in this way.
And the Palestinians are.
The Palestinians are unified in this way, and so on. And so it's very easy for the center to play one against the other and never get somewhere.
So it's a complicated issue. It's not at all simple, and it would vary from context to context.
But I just say that our approach, at least, and maybe certainly not the best approach, but we start with something that's extremely simple. And of course, it immediately gets very complicated. But if we start with something complicated, then our goal is to make it simple. So we proceed in one way. We can argue about which is a better approach.
Yes, I want to thank you, both of you, of your speech and your model. Yes, actually I like it, and I think there's a way to apply this model to Catalonia. No easy perhaps, but possible. Yes, I think perhaps in Catalonia the voice option, there was in the moment of the Statute of Autonomy in 2006, and there's a voice ignored from the state. That's your model option, and we go then to the exit option, and I think that's a depend central state of us. The central state depend of Catalonia, but there's a cultural preferences in there. So they explain that the position of the state, the position of the Spain, and the Catalonia position. There's a culture is not only the language. There is a big option there, and it's not here. It's not a region in the base of differences, cultural ideas. But I think it's a cultural differences between Catalonia and the Castilian and the other regions of Spain. And that's the culture of bargaining, just the culture of no negotiate nothing. And this is here a different culture of negotiating, and also a culture of Mediterranean culture, of many more economic, open economy, I think is a sort of different culture, but yes, there is a different culture there. And I agree also with you that there is an important issue here about the public supporters of the exit and of the secession action, actually. And I think the model is, yes, I think it's applied, it's possible, it's near to Catalonia in this basis of very, very simple analysis. And I thank you for this, I think, yes.
I have a question. Let me ask a question. I have a question on we talked a lot about the credibility, but I have a question on the dependence. Do you consider kind of beyond economic factors, electoral or sociological factors, do you consider a kind of ideological factor, or let's, I mean, a philosophical dependence, in the sense that, for instance, I don't know, France in Corsica, they do not, it's not a big deal, Corsica, in terms of economy or whatever, but I would not imagine France granting autonomy or granting autonomy, yes, of course, but granting self-determination to Corsica, whatever, even if in a scenario in which they were like a huge majority or an overqualified majority. And I think that here we talk about an ideological or a nationalistic dependence, which is also part of the Spanish central state minded politicians, or even in Italy, right? And I have another question related to this dependence idea, which is, how do you explain very important concessions that have been made in the past? For instance, in Italy, the special autonomous regions, which were not secessionists at all at the time that they were granted huge powers, which were asymmetrical related to other regions. And I think that there was no exit credibility or whatever at the time that they were granted this autonomy concession. So I think that we can see huge concessions in absence of this exit credibility. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, are you referring in Italy to the Mezzogiorno?
To the Mezzogiorno, or Sardinia, Sicilia, Val d'Aosta, South Tyrol?
Okay.
I mean, there are at least 5 regions with the state of autonomy.
Right, so that's an interesting point. I don't know. I mean, clearly,
I think in South Tyrol there was some.
South Tyrol was.
And they got a lot of concessions.
Right, I'll tell you that. Yeah. But the Mezzogiorno was an issue. I mean, there was a lot of very poor. There was a lot of migration from the Mezzogiorno to the north, and it was really creating a lot of political difficulties in the north. I think that it could well be something, a reaction against trying to halt that refugee flow, that internal migration, and do something also to unseat the mafia to some degree in Mezzogiorno, which was an issue. But I think it's an interesting point, and we certainly didn't consider that. I want to say one other thing. I agree with you about France. I can't imagine that, I mean, France had a hard time getting rid of, letting Algeria go, which was not even, part of contiguity to, I mean, neither is Corsica, but it's closer. But they had a very hard time with Algeria, and it was really serious. And I can't imagine that they would willingly let the Corsicans go because of what this very strong set of nationalist ideology is. So I think that would have to be factored in. I don't know, David, the Czech case. That's an interesting case. Why did the Czechs not have that reaction towards secession?
The creation of Czechoslovakia was artificial to begin with, in the sense
as was the creation of France.
I mean, every state is artificial in some sense, but I mean, in the idea that in 1918, the Slovaks didn't want to be part of Hungary, as they had been, and the Czechs didn't want to be outnumbered by the Germans. And so they thought, get something, I get something. We'll call it
It's a marriage of
Czechoslovakia.
convenience.
Yeah, a marriage of convenience, which was then a divorce of convenience.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's it. I think, and you could be right, I don't know the Spanish case, but you could be right that there's a similar kind of, we don't want to let anything go, because that would destroy our, and it could also lead to this domino effect. I don't think that's, the domino effect is not an issue so much in France as it would be here, but I do think you're right, that the French would fight like tooth and nail to keep Corsica in and any other potential part of the country.
I would also say it's an interesting question. We spent last summer in Corsica trying to understand the demand for nationalist parties in Corsica. We haven't finished the paper yet, but we've been working on it. And the Corsicans described the situation as, or described the French state as Jacobin paranoia, and sort of essentially, as you were describing it, the central government just can't even conceive of letting go, even of an island, which is usually the first.
And the Corsicans, nationalists themselves, refer to themselves as an internal colony. And they referred, we were talking to one of these politicians, and we walked by the prefecture in the south. He said, "Oh, that's the French embassy."
And just speculate, I wonder if it has something to do not only with the ideology, but the point, but the sort of state formation, and when the state formed, and then when the autonomy was demanded. And so if it's, if it's formed in a certain way, and then the demand for autonomy comes much later, it's easier to say no, because they've already they're set in there. If it's sort of in the process, then they can kind of give and take with each other. We give you autonomy, you support the state formation, sort of. And once later down the road, the region has less ability to just a speculation.
But I think the timing of state formation is key in that respect. And the more distant in the past the state formation is, the more legitimate it seems in the present. In that sense, Spain goes way back, probably much farther back than France in its centralization to some degree. Thinking about Reagan, thinking about the Inquisition, those were things that happened way before France became. France didn't become a nation state until the 19th century. In Spain, it was earlier. And so the point that you make about Spain may be even stronger than it is about France.
And interesting, maybe you have some thoughts on this. I was wondering why the Basques in French don't ask for anything. Well, in Spain they behave quite differently.
There is this comparative study on a specific region wrote by Michael Hechter on this small region between France and Catalonia, which is called Barcelona. And she compared secessionist support in Barcelona and in northern Sardinia in France, and the factors explaining it and so on. And she concluded that the most important factor was public school and civil servant opportunities that were granted to the French side, that was granted to the French side during the 19th century, that the southern part of Sardinia was not these possibilities within the Spanish structure. But anyway, to the question.
Where was that published?
It was published, I don't remember, but I can give you the reference. I think published on
We were talking about Czechoslovakia. There's a complementary argument which is more or less the following. Slovakia wanted a loose federation. Czechia wanted a more unitarian federation, or just a unitarian country. So the second best for both was separation. It was not really, as you said, this is complementary, as you said, because it was an artificial state, because it was a young state. One wanted a loose federation, the other wanted a unitarian state, put it simple. So what's the second best? Separation. And that was the second best for both. But Slovakia it's not sure that wanted secession as the first option. So more or less this, for instance, is defended by Peter Radan. So about your model, I have this. I will put problems, but of course models are for making things simple. Right? But now our role is to put problems in the model. But yeah, maybe voice and threat of secession, they go together. If you don't do me this, I will secede. That's at least it goes implicitly most of the time. So, or not most, but often. Often goes implicitly. If you don't give me this, I secede. Then that's one problem. So voice and threat of exit goes together. Second problem is like when voice. Sorry, voice.
That's already we already.
Yeah.
That's in them.
Yeah. So no, yeah, but that's kind of problems that then because it makes then it's more difficult to make these kind of routes that you were saying. Then there's another problem that ignoring. You can ignore secession or not, or the threat of secession. Then, if you ignore it or you don't ignore it, then you have a negotiated and smooth secession or a unilateral and hard secession. For me, this changes a lot. The movement or the preference on secession can change a lot if it's a smooth secession or it's a hard secession.
What do you mean, smooth and hard?
Smooth, for instance, it would be a secession like you negotiate with Spain and you remain in the European Union. That is a smooth secession. That here in Catalonia could be amazingly supportive. But what happens if you ignore secession and the secession movement and you put it hard to the secession? You can only have secession if you have it unilaterally, with no recognition and with a very hard transition to, and then it changes a lot the support. So that's why I'm saying a smooth and hard. I don't know, maybe you can find better names for that. But I'm sure that in democratic context that has a big relevance. And that's more or less what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, it affects the costs.
Yeah, it affects the cost, exactly. So that you can put it in that way to negotiate the smooth way or yeah. But more or less I would agree that as a first sight it might work. Your model I think is quite I'm putting problems, but I'm not questioning the whole model.
Let me ask a question of you. What would it take for the Spanish state to allow a referendum in Catalonia?
Maybe that's, so I cannot tell you about that because maybe that affects my job, but I would say the following. The Spanish are very aware that a smooth secession, it will have a lot of support in Catalonia, right? But if Spain puts it hard, the secession support goes weaker and weaker. When you have, if they give us the Scottish United Kingdom solution, they are really scared of that. If they put that, yeah, they are nice and we will negotiate and you'll have the referendum and then we'll see with the European Union, we'll find a deal, then I think secession would be among us very quick.
Yeah.
And then if the
what kind of pressure could Catalonia exert on the center to get them to offer a referendum?
I guess because voice doesn't only come from a referendum. Voice comes from many sources. That can be voice, for instance, the business people going together, it's a voice too. So, and we have to find a prior voice. So in order to have the referendum voice, which is a clear voice, we need a previous voice. And this voice, for instance, is political parties, a strong majority or a strong group of political parties and deputies asking for the referendum. So you need a prior voice to have then the referendum voice.
And that does not yet exist?
Maybe not strong enough.
I see. So if
but we'll see. That might be a possibility. I'm not sure about that.
So your guess, for instance, is if the secessionist parties had 70% vote, then Spain would be forced to allow a referendum?
At least it would be more difficult
More difficult for them to
deny it.
ignore it.
It would be more difficult to
I see,
deny.
okay.
No, not forced. More difficult to deny.
More difficult to deny.
Your answer points the question of the time dimension of your model. So we know in Catalonia and in all the regions of the world that this model is not a picture. This model is repeating, it's a cycle, it's repeating itself. Right. So by ignoring secessionist demands, you are raising the costs of doing secession, here at least in the Spanish context, because by ignoring these demands, secession can increase, but it can reach a certain level, because people know that if the Spanish government keeps ignoring the demands, a unilateral strategy would be much more costly than an agreed strategy. And the Spanish government knows that, so keeps making the costs grow of these demands, right? So there is this, but then we have a counter model. For instance, in Quebec or in Scotland, they already know that they have the exit option granted. They have a granted exit option.
I mean, the possibility of a referendum.
The possibility of a referendum. I don't know if they have a full secession grant. But I think that what we should expect by a comparative approach, it would be that in these cases, in the cases of Quebec and Scotland, this negotiation approach or bargaining power would decrease because they have this secession option granted. But what we observe is that it's not exactly decreasing this bargaining capacity. So I think that we are missing something here. I don't know. There is this time dimension. This game keeps repeating itself. And then the costs and benefits of each option change across time.
Well, is there any evidence that
three referenda, right?
Yeah.
75 to 85.
Two referendums.
But
In the 80s and 90s.
so is there any evidence that support in favor of a referendum in Catalonia has increased as a result of the center's refusal? Or has it decreased or has it changed at all?
It increased, but it has reached a certain peak. It reached
What's the peak? What's the peak?
The peak is this.
80%.
That's the referendum. That's the referendum.
And they're still ignoring.
That's the problem. But that's the referendum demand.
Oh, yes. No, this is I understand that. The referendum is 80% and they're ignoring. So that what's your argument?
Not exactly as a voice. This is more the statistical showing that, but there's not an organized like society which often 80% demanding that. I mean, there's not the 80% of the Catalan Parliament asking that, but more or less the statistics say that maybe 70, but yeah, a very large of Catalan people living in Catalonia for a certain period are asking about 70% want a referendum, and in these 70% there's people who favor independence and people that will not.
Right. But they want, but Madrid is ignoring this.
Yeah, because this kind of voice have different. They want a referendum, but they want a referendum in different ways. For instance, one they say I want a referendum, but only if it's legal and only if it's agreed with Spain. So if it's legal and it's agreed, it's difficult to get it because you want a referendum, but you are putting conditions that are difficult to get.
So that's a misleading number.
No. It's just there are two stages.
Yeah, but it's not a misleading number.
The first stage, a lot of people want the opportunity to vote, which is a normal democratic right.
They don't agree about
And
what
then
that.
above that,
But they don't agree about what that vote should be.
They don't agree on the means of.
I mean the phrasing of the vote.
No, not the phrasing.
On the means of asking this referendum.
Yeah. So that weakens. That seems to be that weakens the polls.
Maybe we could. Maybe this 70% goes together with the sense that of unity usually makes stronger claims of democracy, not in other.
But I think that there is the common sense approach is that an agreed or referendum is the first preference of all these people waiting for a referendum. That's the first preference.
Yes.
But of course, some people say, well, my second preference would not be a unilateral.
Exactly.
My second preference wouldn't be a unilateral way. I prefer the status quo as a second preference.
Yeah.
But other people say, well, if we don't get this agreement, then we should go our way, even if it means unilateral secession, or at least if it means organizing a referendum yourself. And that's the approach. And that raises a point on how credibility and voice approach is done in each case. Because we have several actors proposing things, and each actor has a different preference structure. And then this makes the situation much more complex, and this happens at the Catalan or the regional side and at the state level side. There are several actors different preferences.
I mean, in a way it complicates it because there are several actors, but in a way it also simplifies it because there are only two options. Right? There's exit and loyalty. Status quo, which is loyalty, and then there's exit. It seems.
No,
right?
but exit has to the smooth exit or the hard exit. That's why I was saying that that is. But that's true. That.
But we know it would be if there's no voice, then it would be a hard exit. Right? Only through voice.
Exactly, and that makes the both sides with a hard secession. It's like 50-50. It's
less
very
support.
Very difficult.
I mean, if you look at the history of secession for the past 200 years since Rome Soviet, most of the secessions have been hard in your terms. That is to say, the central government did not agree with it. A war ensued between the two sides. If the region managed to win a military victory, it became independent. If it lost, it became a subjugated region again. In the cases where there is a peaceful secession, so you have
Norway,
from Sweden,
Sweden,
Slovakia,
Iceland,
and then a bunch of cases in which the state basically fell apart. The end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the end of the Soviet Union. So, otherwise, to the extent that the state could, in most cases, did not agree with secession, not surprising, and it was a hard exit.
I agree with you that it would be a new case, but the Quebec and Scotland case as eventual independence, they were leading to this path that Catalonia would like to have, this kind of peaceful, agreed, rational, and reasonable secession. So, but we are going in a new path. Yeah.
So there's a very interesting.
I mean, the problem is that it seems like now really the only region asking for this is Catalonia. And if there were, so on the one hand, that's an advantage, right? Because there's this idea that concessions are only offered, or let's say they're not offered, if there are multiple people asking for it. Because then, if they grant to one, they have to grant to 2, 3, 4. But on the other hand, so that says that works in Catalonia's favor. And it's the only one asking for the right to vote for secession. There was other example I can't remember.
But history is telling more or less that secessions go together. I mean, and you put it in the dismantling of states. For instance, in Yugoslavia, Slovakia starting, and then the other. It's like a boost. There's a boost.
But that was the collapse of the center.
Yeah, that's the collapse. But the collapse of the center sometimes starting with a secession in the periphery.
Yeah. But you know, the Irish case is a very interesting case because Ireland did not actually achieve military victory over England, but the English public was absolutely devastated by losses in World War I and had no appetite whatsoever to fight another war at that particular point in time, and that was very much in the Irish.
That's more or less the independence of the independence of Portugal. It's more or less in the 17th century. Catalonia is making a big war against Spain. It's a kind of secession war, not exactly, but because at that time the state were formed, but it was a kind of secession war. And Spain was really exhausted of the war. They defeat us quite completely, and then Portugal. now I'm taking the independence, and they got independence in a way. Again, I'm putting things very simple, but yeah, of course, when the central state, when the parent state is exhausted of wars, and so yeah, sometimes that's facts that go against norms, because you don't want to have an exhausted parent state, but yeah, facts tell that when the parent state is exhausted, you get independence.
But I would be careful when we talk about this, the rationality, when we compare rationality and not colonial rule, or in these Middle Ages examples. We cannot compare in the same way colonial rule with democratic state. So here we are talking about a strong preference for the status quo, which can be run the first, the second, and third, but the status quo is still a liberal democracy and so on and so forth. So we are talking about the democratic process, and this has nothing to do, in my opinion. There is always this rational choice approach, but it would be a bit true to apply the rational choice all secessions since the Congress of Vienna, and then comparing it to the Catalan or Shorter situation.
And so the other example that is consistent with this exhaustion argument, right? So Yugoslavia is known as a case where there was a lot of hard secessions, right? But Montenegro had a referendum at the end.
Where?
Montenegro. In 2006.
Yeah.
Completely peaceful. And now it's an independent state.
That
Precisely because it fought Bosnia, Croatia, a little bit Slovenia, and Kosovo. At the end of it, everybody was against it, and everybody was intervening, and the state was exhausted. It just wanted to get some other things that were fighting everyone. Even though Montenegro is as close to Serbia culturally as more than any of the others. It's basically as close to language, as close to religion. It's not a Catholic one like Slovenia or Croatia. It's not a Muslim one like Kosovo. So you would think they want to keep something that's very close to similar. By 2006, 4 wars later, it's changed.
And the very curious policy of the United States in Syria, I think, also represents a certain kind of exhaustion on the part of the American government to support troops on the ground in the Middle East. And I think that's accounts for Obama's policy with respect to that. And since Russia did not fight in Iraq, did not fight in Iraq and Afghanistan a long time ago in Afghanistan, the Russian public is much more willing to consider intervention in Syria than the American.
This is a bigger theory that I'm trying to build, but sometimes we lose memory of dramatic events, and when the dramatic events are a bit far, then we are willing to take it again. But and this now we don't remember the Civil War, now the Spanish Civil War. In Europe we don't remember the Second World War, and that's why, because if the United Kingdom was remembering the Second World War, maybe they wouldn't exit the European Union, because the European Union is not only a market, it's about putting countries together and not having the Third World War. So sometimes when dramatic issues are too far, then we forget about them.
Absolutely correct. And there's very good cognitive psychology.
I'm not a psychologist, but I think it's very good.
Well, more questions, comments? Well, thank you, professors, for coming. We are happy to have you here, and thank you very much.
Thank you all for your questions
Very
and
interesting
this lively discussion. It was a little fun for us.
Now we learned a lot.
Thank you.
That's great.